Nobody was safe during the Cold War, not even the President of the United States. Although communism started on the other side of the world, it eventually reached America. On November 22nd, 1963, it appeared in Dallas, Texas, and shook the world. My name is Josh Cates, and today I'll be talking about Camelot's jungle, Kennedy, and the Vietnam War. Before he was president, he was congressman. Representative John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts in 1951 traveled to the Middle East and Asia. He came back to the U.S. reporting that if the West did not actively fight for the freedom of nations in the Middle East and Asia, those regions would soon fall to communism. In the mid-1950s, a civil war broke out in Vietnam. But Vietnam was really far away from the United States. In fact, if you were in space, and the U.S. wasn't yet, but they would be in a few years, but in space, it's impossible to see Vietnam and the contiguous U.S. at the same time. That's how far apart they are. There's the west coast of the U.S. You can't see Vietnam. Here's the east coast of the U.S. You still can't see Vietnam. They're really far apart. But Kennedy wasn't worried about communism in Vietnam. He was worried about it spreading. And he was right. Cuba is less than 200 miles away from Miami. In 1959, while Kennedy was in the Senate, Fidel Castro completed his overthrow of the Cuban government and made Cuba the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. This was a problem, because Cuba is in with missile range of many U.S. cities. And current U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower knew this was a problem and knew that he needed to do something about it. So he started planning an invasion of mainland Cuba. And when Kennedy took office in January of 1961, Kennedy took over this plan. The plan was to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs to help disguise U.S. support for the invasion. Kennedy didn't want Cuba to know that the U.S. was behind the invasion, so he didn't choose a point on the northern coast, he chose one on the southern coast. Kennedy's plan was to train Cuban exiles to invade the island. And the irony of this training is that Kennedy was very open, that he was willing to fight guerrilla warfare wherever it took place. But the way that the CIA trained those Cuban exiles to invade Cuba was using guerrilla warfare. On April 17th, 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, and they were met by Fidel Castro and the Cuban military, and the invasion was a failure. Out of the 1,400 men who invaded, 1,200 were captured and another 100 were killed. Because the invasion failed, Kennedy started planning another invasion with the codename Operation Mongoose. And Operation Mongoose had the same objective of the original invasion of the Bay of Pigs, which was to overthrow Castro and reinstate a democratic government in Cuba. Operation Mongoose was set to occur in October of 1962, but something got in the way. In the spring and summer of 1962, the U.S. military started detecting an increase in arms shipments from the USSR to Cuba. On October 14, 1962, a U.S. aircraft captured pictures of a missile launch site in Cuba. Kennedy immediately met with a group of high-ranking executives, and they presented him with three options. 1. Pursue diplomacy with Cuban leader Fidel Castro and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. 2. Tell the Navy to form a naval blockade of Cuba and prevent the island from receiving further shipments from the USSR to Cuba of missiles. And 3 was to bomb all of the missile sites. Now, Kennedy was a diplomat, so he chose a combination of options 1 and 2, and he ordered a naval blockade of the island on October 22nd, 1962. This naval blockade would buy him enough time to negotiate with the communist leaders, and 6 days later, on October 28th, reach an agreement with those leaders. This agreement was Cuba promised to get rid of its missiles, and the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. But there was a secret third component, and the third component was that the U.S. also promised to take all of its missiles out of Turkey, which was in close proximity to the USSR. But the fact that the U.S. did that didn't become public for another 25 years. While all of that was happening in the Caribbean, Kennedy was working with fellow Catholic and fellow anti-communist South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem. And although the men started seeing eye to eye, as Diem became more and more authoritarian, the relationship started to disintegrate. Now, on November 2nd, 1963, under the watch of Kennedy's administration, Diem was assassinated by a group of his own men. And 20 days later, on November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, during a parade. Now, Kennedy was shot and killed by a man named Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald, an ex-Marine sharpshooter, defected to the USSR in 1959. He married a Russian woman and had a daughter. When the USSR rejected his request for citizenship, he tried to commit suicide. And upon returning to the United States in mid-1962, he drove down to Mexico City, where he applied for a Cuban visa at the Cuban embassy in Mexico. Now, there was no trial for the murder of President Kennedy. The reason being, Oswald was murdered before a trial could be held. Oswald was murdered 2 days after he murdered President Kennedy by a man named Jack Ruby, and it was caught on live television. Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner, took a trip to Havana, Cuba in 1959. And Jack Ruby's brother, Earl Ruby, sent a telegram to Havana, Cuba in 1962. When Kennedy was assassinated, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took office. This was something that Kennedy was terrified of. Jacqueline Kennedy, JFK's wife, admitted that JFK had conversations with his brother, Robert Kennedy, Attorney General of the United States, where they would try to come up with plans to ensure that Johnson never became president, because they were worried about the sake of America under his leadership. But it turns out that it wasn't up to Kennedy. And Johnson ultimately made decisions that led to U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam in 1973, and eventually on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolling into Saigon, effectively ending the Vietnam War. There's no doubt that the assassination of President Kennedy helped North Vietnam win the Vietnam War. But what Kennedy could have done if he simply had more time will never be known. Thank you.